Welcome, everyone, to our conversation. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Thomas Tale, who is a professor of psychology at York University in the History and Theory of Psychology program. Professor Tale is the author of the 2005 book Critique of Psychology, From Kant to Postcolonial Theory. And finding and reading this book was a major event during my graduate school studies, as I am sure it is for many others. More recently, he has written Outline of Theoretical Psychology, and he has also co-authored A Critical History and Philosophy of Psychology together with Richard Walsh and Angelina Baidala.
I think she says Baidala, but
Baidala. Okay. Thank you. He has edited third person, second person, mixed up. You've edited the Encyclopedia of Critical Psychology, as well as another volume called Re-envisioning Theoretical Psychology, Diverging Ideas and Practices, and many articles on a wide range of topics from psychology of work, psychology of anti-globalization, fascist subjectivity, and the place of humanities in psychology. Professor Tale received the Theodore Sarbin Award from Division 24 of APA in 2019. And I've been looking forward to this interview. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's begin. My first question is, I wanted to ask you, from your own perspective, how you describe your field of work within the broader landscape of psychology.
Yeah, so I would basically say I'm a theoretical psychologist. I'm a critical theoretical psychologist, and that of course requires some explication what that means. So when I talk about theoretical psychology, I specifically mean a more philosophically oriented theoretical psychology, meaning everybody does cognitive psychology or developmental psychology or personality. Well, we also theoretical psychology work with theories as well. But that's not what I mean by theoretical psychology from a philosophical perspective. What I mean is looking at the ontological or ontic, epistemic, and ethical problems or issues of psychology. That is what I mean by theoretical psychology. Psychology has to deal with methodological problems, epistemological problems, I call them, ontological problems, and also ethical problems. And I, of course, in the book, have lots of examples of what this means. On the other hand, there's a critical tradition, which I'm also part of. And then we have to define, what do you mean by critical tradition? What do you mean by critical psychology? And I think, one stream of critical psychology is indeed the critique of psychology. And this can be done from a variety of perspectives. And there are long traditions, actually, of people having criticized, for example, the crisis of psychology. There's another tradition which I am probably also close to, which is the question, how can we do justice to the subject matter of psychology through psychological theory? So what we have in psychology is what I always call the subdivision of the subject matter. So we divide the subject matter, which is arguably the wholeness of somatopsychological first-person mental life, if I can use this abstract definition. And in psychology, we have divided the subject matter into, let's say, traditionally thinking, feeling, willing, or cognition, emotion, motivation, to use this division. And then we subdivide in cognitive psychology further, let's say, into memory, perception, sometimes attention, and then we subdivide this further into long-term, short-term, and so forth. And then we divide this further, and then we look at how one small element in this subdivided landscape relates to another subdivided element in this small landscape. And from my perspective, this is not doing justice to the subject matter of psychology, because in the concrete lived experience, there's a certain wholeness that we experience. Yes, we can divide our own subjectivity into these elements, and we can think about our own subjectivity in those terms, but there's also an integrated wholeness when it comes to our subjectivity. So the question is, and I think there's also a tradition out there, how can we do justice to the subject matter of psychology. Let's say, how can we do justice to subjectivity through our theories and through our research? There's another stream in critical psychology, and I'm familiar with this as well, but I'm not necessarily incorporating that beyond some principles into critical theoretical psychology, namely the question, how can we do justice with people? How can we do justice to people? Like, let's consider what critical community psychologists are doing or participatory action researchers are doing. There's indeed the question, how can we do justice with and for people? How do we do a psychology that is able to do that? And as a theoretical psychologist, I'm not necessarily going out and practice that, but it informs, so to say, my own theorizing as well. And finally, I think this is connected to the other elements of critical psychology. How can we do justice to history, culture, and society in psychological theory? So, again, if we bring it back to subjectivity, well, my own subjectivity is entangled with history, is entangled with culture, and is entangled with society. And how can we do justice to those issues when we theorize in psychology? So that is how I would, in a nutshell, summarize what I'm basically doing as a theoretical psychologist, as a critical theoretical psychologist, with the emphasis on, philosophical problems, but also emphasis on the question, how can we do justice to let's say, subjectivity as being an important aspect of my theorizing. Mm-hmm. And just as a side remark, there are actually, of course, academic organizations that deal with those problems. There is the International Society for Theoretical Psychology. There is the Society for Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology within the American Psychological Association. And there is the History, Theory, and Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology section within the Canadian Psychological Association. So there exist academic organizations, there exist journals that allow you to publish in this field of work.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great. Thank you for that detailed response. I think you successfully kind of identified the position of your field within the broader framework of psychology. I also wanted to ask you about possible disagreements or distinctions, not necessarily debates and disagreements, but your position within critical psychology. You touched on a little bit on this already when you said that indigenous psychology is not something that you're closely involved with, but what else? So your position within your field of theoretical.
Yes, this is difficult to decide for oneself. So to a certain degree, other people have to decide this. But let me say what my intentions are. I think my intentions are indeed to synthesize various traditions. I think that is an important intention that I have. So coming from a German language critical tradition, I'm very much interested, how can we connect this to European and North American traditions, as well as traditions outside of the global North, which is important to me as well, because I think there's a certain Euro-American bias when it comes to critical psychology. And clearly, when it comes to issues such as race theory and racism and scientific racism is a topic that I've been interested in for a long time. It is clear that you can learn more from diversity scholars than, let's say, just from a European tradition. An intent is, I think I have the intent of integrate various traditions in my own work. And this means, yes, to consider the critique of psychology and was said before, but also think with participatory action research, to think with critical community psychology, to think with critical health psychology, to think with critical psychology of inequality, queer theories, critical race theories, critical psychology of climate change to make it more contemporary, and also critical disability status is important to me to integrate those traditions. Maybe this allows me to develop a broad horizon, which doesn't guarantee, I think, better knowledge, but a broad horizon, I think, sets the conditions for the possibility of better knowledge. So it doesn't guarantee better knowledge automatically, I think, but it can provide the conditions for the possibility of better knowledge if you develop a broad horizon. And maybe horizon is not even the best term. Maybe you should call it an attitude. And if I take epistemic modesty seriously, I did a paper on epistemic modesty. One could argue that maybe completely unique positions are not possible. But what I'm interested in is not only to stand on the shoulders of giants, as scientists sometimes argue, and maybe to look from the shoulders of giants into the future, but maybe to use the shoulders to jump into open space to find your own path. So I think that is what I would argue is the attitude. Let's stand on the shoulders of giants and jump into the open space to find your own path. So this means expanding the boundaries and traditions of psychology, expanding the boundaries of critical psychology. For example, I think you alluded to that, the idea that we should include the psychological humanities into psychology, the idea that we can learn about the psychological, about mental life, when we include philosophy, history, social theory, political theory, economic theory, anthropology, educational theory, feminist theory, and so forth, and even the arts. So we can learn about mental life if we include, for example, the arts. And this is what I mean by expanding the boundaries of psychology. And people are going to do that in different ways, but laying out this idea that we should do this is important. Maybe, and this is a critique maybe then of the humanities, let's find the truth on the quotation mark in reality and not in books. So the humanities sometimes have a strong focus on big names, on masterpieces in their discipline, and you have to do an extensive interpretation of this book. And I say, yes, books help, but let's not find the truth in books. Let's find the truth actually in social reality. And again, use the book as a starting point for your own investigations. Yeah. Realizing, and this is maybe applies more to critical psychology, that one is part of a movement, a broad movement, a very diverse movement, and it should never end up being a cult where people say this is what you have to read, and if you don't read this and if you don't do this, you're not a critical psychology. So if you like, in Piagetian terms, the importance of assimilating and accommodating. So we put stuff into our given structure, but we also want to change our cognitive structure in order to make sense of what's happening out in the psychosocial reality, and in order to develop maybe new things. And in my own work, I have described this as an element of what I'm doing is deconstruction, or call it critique, the critique of psychology. And we want to critique implicit models, implicit assumptions about what it means to be humans. We want to criticize, let's say, a positivist methodology. We want to criticize that ethics is sometimes just an add-on feature that is a nuisance rather than something that should be actually part of psychological thinking. This would be deconstruction. And then reconstruction is, how did something happen? And I think in the outline of theoretical psychology, I do a reconstructive, how could we reconstruct what we mean by theoretical psychology? This is a reconstructive work, so it has a lot of sources, and I lay out, so to say, a reconstruct how we could lay out a field in terms of reconstruction. And then the final thing, what I call construction. So, okay, maybe not the most elegant, deconstruction, reconstruction, and construction. Where can we go from here? So what can we build based on what we're doing? And so for example, are very much interested in a theory of subjectivity, which is a theory development or concept development is basically construction. Let's construct concepts in critical theoretical psychology. Let's develop a theory of subjectivity. And if reconstruction is not completely clear, it's not necessarily history. But for example, you can ask the question, why do we have this enormous increase in psychology as a field in terms of departments, students, academics, journal articles, journals? Why do we have this enormous increase? That's an interesting question. So you can, first of all, establish that as a fact, and then we can use different data, of course, to establish the fact. And once one of my students, PhD students, pointed out to me, I think he was from Turkey, and he pointed out to me that Turkey in 2002 had 14 psychology departments, and in 2022 it had 116 psychology departments. Why? And you can find a similar pattern earlier, of course, maybe in European countries and in Northern America, but you can find similar patterns, and I don't have all the data, of course, now prepared here, in other continents as well. Why do we have this enormous increase of psychology? And we can reconstruct it. So we can, for example, argue, just to give you some ideas how I would go about doing a reconstruction, which I haven't done. Norbert Elias has once talked about the process of civilization. And maybe civilization is not the best term anymore nowadays, but that is what he used originally. And the idea is that the process of civilization, let's call it the process of modernization, is a process of individualization. And if the process of modernization is a process of individualization, meaning that we focus more and more on individuals, and people focus more and more on individuals and themselves, yes, you have demand for a discipline that focuses exactly on individuals, and that would be psychology. That would be one answer. And we can challenge that whether this is the best answer or not. You could make a critical argument, say, well, we have the increase of psychology because psychology is very good at collaborating and colluding with the status quo. So psychology, in that sense, is an adaptation science, an adjustment science, and a control science. So I can select people who can emigrate or immigrate into the United States, which was done, of course, at the beginning of the 20th century with intelligence testing, making quotas based on intelligence tests and national IQs, ethnic IQs, which country has which IQ, and we establish immigration quotas based on national IQ. That is a control science. And psychology is always very good in collaborating with the status quo and adapting people to their status quo. And this leads us, so to say, to a third stream, how one could think about this, is, of course, the neoliberalization in the last 50 years, where you have psychology's collusion with neoliberalism, which means not only external control, external adjustment, external adaptation, but this has moved to self-adaptation, self-adjustment, and self-control. So I have to internalize that I have to control myself. I have to internalize that I have to adjust myself to the status quo, or that I have to adapt to the status quo. So let me give you an example of what I mean by this. So let's say you have oppressive working conditions. And the neoliberal answer would be, the neoliberal psychological answer would be, well, go to if you get angry, go to a therapist, regulate your emotions, learn to regulate your emotions. From a critical perspective, of course, we would take those oppressive working conditions seriously. And what do your emotions actually say you about reality? And it's not just regulating your emotions and adapting emotion and self-adapting and learning how to adjust and control and adapt your emotions, but learning from those emotions as a source of insight for what is wrong in sociocultural reality, for example. But my point is, psychology fulfills, I think, very clear functions in a modernized, neoliberal, capitalist world that to a certain degree would explain the expansion of psychology, and that is reconstructive work. So yes, in this example, you could make the argument, well, deconstruction and reconstruction and construction are intertwined, and I agree with that actually. So it's not a clear, this is only deconstruction, it's only reconstruction, they can overlap. So a certain, even in the reconstruction of why is there an increase of psychology, I have certain critical arguments, I try to reconstruct for historical material, certain arguments, and the question is, where do we go from here? Is there an alternative actually to psychologization? And my point was, yes, maybe take oppressive working conditions seriously, take maybe that somebody gets angry about their oppressive working conditions seriously as well. So this is what I would say, that maybe have an awareness on what I do with theorizing and what I want with theorizing, and maybe that is to a certain degree unique, I don't know. And what unique contributions I have is actually, I think, for others to decide actually.
Great. I want to add something, and this is like something I personally admire about your work, and I like maybe about you as a person. I don't know, feel free to disagree with this, but there's something about the spirit of your work that is very anti-comfort zone, anti-being comfortable with the state of affairs, with the status quo. And I detect that in some people at a very embodied level. It's not just something that they express in their works. And when I was in cognitive science in my graduate schools and, my formal training, I was that was a source of discontent for me, how comfortable people were. But I was so surprised to see that even when I came to theoretical psychology conferences, that was like, for some people, that's their comfort zone. So anyways, I wanted to ask you about influences, scholarly and non-scholarly influences. I know based on what you said, we can already identify the influence of Michel Foucault, for example, but I know that you did scholarship on Klaus Holzkamp and the critical tradition in Germany, German-speaking countries, and Frankfurt School. Any other influences? And we can even maybe talk about the effect of immigration, like you coming from having contact with several different languages and cultures, if that also has an effect.
Yes. So I think in terms of my own education and my own training, I would say yes, there's Immanuel Kant who has an influence. Jürgen Habermas has had an influence in Klaus Holzkamp. But I think it's also important, what I said before, to move away from the masters and the authority of the masters, quotation mark, and I mentioned here 3 guys, obviously, to intellectual movements. And I could, of course, say hermeneutics was also important to me, and then I could drop the name Tiltai and Gadamer. But I think also feminism, people like Sandra Harding and her work in the philosophy of science, or even Thomas Kuhn, and to a certain degree, queer theory, which was discomforting my own comfort zones, maybe was important. And maybe it's not so much anymore that we should talk about one person, one book, but about indeed sort of say certain streams of thinking and post-colonial theory and critical race theory. And again, so I think, why do I want to move away from masters to intellectual movements? Because masters are, of course, humans. Humans are fallible, and humans also always have prejudices, traditions, horizons, to use a Gadamerian term, and they have a subjectivity. And subjectivity always includes, for me, so this is a slightly different theory of subjectivity, it always includes society, history, and culture. And therefore, there's a certain limitations. So we can learn from the so-called masterworks. That's sort of say a strong tradition, of course, in the humanities, but we also have to interrogate the limitations of those works. And for me, it's always been strange to suggest that ideas developed 150 years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, should be considered valid automatically for today. They can inform us, they can form our own traditions, but they are still part of a time and a context. If we take, so to say, the contextuality and temporality of knowledge seriously. So I find it strange when people say to me, Marx said this, Freud said this, Holzkamp said this, because if they say this, I have to assess to which degree this is still relevant or significant for today. Not just because they said it, it's relevant, but I have to make this judgment call, this assessment, to which degree they are actually relevant or significant for today. So what I'm trying to say here is, instead of talking about individual people, and yes, one can reconstruct that to a certain degree, I think for me it's more important to think about intellectual streams that have important in a person's argument and move away, so to say, from a person-oriented a reconstruction. And maybe this is my own bias, that I'm more interested in ideas than in persons. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested I'm more interested in intellectual history than biographies, for example. Mm-hmm. So I find intellectual histories more interesting, and that is a personal, I guess, interest that I have. So I think to live among the ideas is, for me, more interesting than to live among masterminds, if you like, or persons that have something to say for sure. Mm-hmm. And your question, the second question, was indeed, so to say, what does migration have something to do with that? And I think it clearly has. Because, to use Gadamer's perspective here, because we all have a certain horizon, by which he means the extent of our own perspective. And we live in a certain tradition, intellectual traditions, for example, and we operate them with certain prejudices when we interpret a topic, when we research something, when we study something. So we have a horizon, tradition, and prejudice. And once you leave, so to say, your tradition or your horizon, you encounter there's other people have very different traditions, let's say, than German critical tradition, mm-hmm. Which is its own unique life world, its own unique tradition, with specific horizons, paradigms, if you like to use Kuhnian terminology, a certain research program, what questions can be asked, what questions are not relevant, and that horizon, I think, changes. And I think you're right, some people might remain them within that tradition and not want to expand that tradition. But for me, who talked about synthesizing and integrating knowledge, it was always, so to say, a learning process, that we can learn something from different horizons and different traditions. So I think the critique of psychology changed for me. The history of psychology even changed for me. Theorizing changed for me because of going through encountering new traditions and new frameworks that I didn't even encounter before. Let's say, if you think about critical disability studies that points out ableist biases, and I think I had and have probably still ableist biases, but it opens some kind of epistemic door once you realize that your assumptions that you have about the disability is really the assumption that a person coming from an ableist tradition has about people with disabilities. And so this is extremely important to encounter those prejudices and work with those prejudices, and hopefully expand the horizons in one's tradition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can I ask a follow-up question to that? Yeah. I agree with your position against the masters, but what we sacrifice by foregoing that is the comfort of, it is so comforting to be a Hegelian or a Husserl scholar or a Merleau-Ponty scholar. It is very comforting. And I see a kind of alluring invitation in certain conservative voices that come in and say, these are the 3 or these are the 10 philosophers we should read. There is one individual I like their work. I mean, it's okay to mention their name. Peter Kreeft said Thomas Aquinas, according to him, he said Aquinas is the single greatest philosopher who ever lived. And understanding Aquinas is an intrinsic value for its own sake, and we should all study him. And so that's antithetical to your position. But somebody who spends time with your position might become vulnerable to that invitation from the other side. I was like, come, we give you comfort by giving you these three philosophers that you can study for the rest of your life. So if you have any responses to that, I would love to hear.
Yeah,
But otherwise, go ahead.
I think you have a certain dialectical development here, because I'm still trained in this tradition. You have to read one work very, very slowly, focus, you do the first chapter of a book for a full year or something like this.
Right.
In philosophy. And that tradition is still familiar to me. And what I'm saying now is, now we might have the opposite tradition, that students don't even, they just, ChatGPT summarize, Hegel for me. And that's all what I need to know about Hegel. Or Wikipedia entry, that's all what I need to know about Hegel. And there's so much knowledge out there, I can't deal with all this stuff. And so I don't have to do in-depth study anymore. I just do everything superficially. I think that's the other extreme. And hopefully, we can go back to a certain degree. Yes, it's important to know some of the traditional canon, but again, we have to expand that canon, and maybe I don't have to read Aquinas, and maybe I have to read, what I mentioned before, Sandor Harding, maybe, or Judith Butler. Maybe that is more important in the canon, but that has to be negotiated and cannot be stated a priori, I think. Right. And so I think you have the humanities tradition who makes exactly that argument. And maybe we have here exactly the contradiction also between psychological science and psychological humanities. In psychological sciences, you can cite anything that's older than 5 years, because if it's older than 5 years, it's outdated and therefore not relevant and not true anymore. So just write research from the last 5 years. And if you don't know the research from the last 5 years, you are not a good scholar anymore. So that is one extreme, that type of argument I've heard. And then in the humanities, you just need to know Aristotle. If you know Aristotle, you know everything. You don't have to read anything else anymore. Or Aquinas, or Kant, or Hegel, or Marx. In the critical tradition, sometimes, people do a text, they read the Capital and they know on page 476 there's this quote, and they become really experts on one single work. But what I said before, is this still representational of what we encounter today, and in which way it is, in which way do we deviate nowadays from that, in which way has the economic reality changed that? Yes, we might take this into account, but we also have to take X, Y, Z into account. So maybe find a certain balance between the approach from the humanities and the approach from the psychological sciences, where it's always only the latest research is meaningful, and anything that is older than 5 years can be forgotten.
Right. Great. So yeah. So I wanted to echo two things that you covered in your response. One is the need to revitalize these old texts or old thinkers that we bring and we pay attention to them. We should reconstruct the justification for studying them. And the second is that your critique of deep dive into these texts is, when you criticize that, you're criticizing as somebody who has done that and continues to do that. It's a kind of internal criticism. It's not something that those people do, and they shouldn't.
Yes, yeah, and I think I think there is always the duty to expand. I call it a duty to expand your horizon. So you cannot, at least from my perspective, you cannot rest with Marx, you cannot rest with Sigmund Freud, or Hegel, or Aquinas, or Aristotle, or any modern thinker as well. So you can also rest with Judith Butler either, I think. So we have to expand our horizons by incorporating and, what I said, assimilating and accommodating new information, and not just putting into a given structure. Everything I encounter can be reinterpreted within one framework. And at that point, it becomes, for me, not doing justice to the complexity of reality anymore.
This is a question I really wanted to ask you. Since the publication of your book, The Critique of Psychology, which is a historical construction of people who have had critical attitudes and movements who have criticized psychology, since that book came out until your outline of theoretical psychology came out, and maybe even more recently, what were some of the changes in your thinking about critical psychology, the role of critical psychology in the discipline? So just basically the kind of shifts between those two texts.
Yeah, I think the as I said before, the goals were first of all different. I mean, the first text was really sort of a more deconstruction of psychology, what is wrong with psychology from different intellectual perspectives. And the outline was really more a reconstruction. How could we lay out the field of theoretical psychology from a critical perspective, which was more reconstructive and hopefully constructive to a certain degree.
I see.
And so I think the goals were slightly different. And so hopefully it reflects, also the expanding of my own horizon and the expanding of my own traditions, and hopefully, a more awareness of my own prejudices in this book. I think there is clearly sort of a difference, and the difficulty of doing something that actually does justice to the full complexity. So I think I increased complexity, but you mentioned the textbook. So let's say you do a critical history and philosophy of psychology. So how can you actually really include psychology in Africa, psychology in Asia, South Asia, East Asia, psychology in Latin America? So this is extremely difficult to do if you don't actually have that horizon. So you want to do it, but actually it means you have to invite different co-authors in order to do that. And so I think we're preparing the second edition, and there are colleagues now from different contexts, and I think they have a stronger even post-colonial perspective. And so this is indeed the question. So are we writing a history of psychology that's basically a Euro-American history of psychology? Yeah.
Right.
Or are we doing a textbook that does justice to the complexity of psychology on different continents? And it's actually extremely difficult. But coming back to your question, I hope that I increased sort of the complexity of my thinking and showing sort of a broader horizon on these topics and a more a broader range, including probably more ontological and ethical issues in the debate. So I hope that has occurred. And of course, I mean, ideally, that is difficult to say. I want to do a book on a theory of subjectivity, so that would be my next project, where I go fully constructive, where I basically suggest these are the elements, or these are the principles that should be included in the theory of subjectivity if we talk about subjectivity, actually. And so it would not be focused on deconstruction, it would not be focused on reconstruction, for there are reconstructive points, but it would be fully reconstructive. What actually do we know about subjectivity? And these are the principles that one would have to take into account when we talk about subjectivity. But that is a project. And as you know, in psychology, it's more difficult to write books because constantly you have to, churn out chapters and articles. And so slow science is difficult in psychology. It's always fast science. And but I mean, I hope I'm going to be able to do that. Maybe I just publish articles and then put it back into a book. That's another option.
Yeah, that's a good option. That's your response to my question was interesting. It kind of revised my question. I was thinking of more like some of your positions might have changed, but you pointed to this dialectical movement, that it's the two projects are in a way, continuation. One is the continuation of the other one.
Yeah, I think it more in that way.
Great. Could you tell us a little bit about this concept that you introduced to the psychological fields, the concept of epistemological violence, and why it is significant?
Yeah, so let me contextualize it indeed.
Sure.
When I talk about the research process, I talk basically about 4 dimensions of the research process. The first one would be what I call what has been called, also in the philosophy of science, the context of discovery. The question, why do you ask this question? The context of justification. Why do you use this methodology, or what methodologies or methods are you using? The context of interpretation. How do you interpret your data? In the context of translation or application, some call it application translation. Translation is also not a self-evident term, meaning how do you give your knowledge away to the academic community or to the public when you publish something? So that's also the context of, so I might interpret my data, but the way I write it up might not completely necessarily be identical the way I interpret it, because I have to follow certain principles. So say the research has those 4 dimensions. And what I argued is, and the reason why I argued this is because, of course, epistemic violence has been coined by Spivak. And Spivak argues that what the West writes about, let's say, India, is epistemically violent. The way they talk about India, the way they talk about the Orient, to use that terminology, is violent knowledge. And I ask myself, so I'm not disagreeing with that, but what does this actually mean in empirical psychology? So if I want to talk to empiricist psychologists, to psychologists that use traditional methodology, how do I convince them that there can be epistemically violent, there can be epistemological violence? And so my argument was, it's in the context of interpretation. And I'm not discounting that it could be in the context of discovery. So if you ask, for example, are people from Italy intellectually inferior than people from England? And this was a question they asked at the beginning of the 20th century, and they believed that Southern Europeans are by nature less intelligent than people from Northern Europe. We forget this sometimes, that this was a research done in the 1920s and before that. You could make the argument this itself is an epistemologically violent question. But traditional psychologists would say, well, you just want to do censorship. You don't want to allow us to ask certain questions, and you are not for academic freedom. And so I did not locate it in the context of discovery. I did not locate it in the context of justification, because you could also make the argument that what method you use, a method can do injustice to a community. Using the same example again, if you test intelligence to immigrants that arrive at Ellis Island, they don't speak the language, they don't know what's going on, what this person wants from me. I never heard about these things. You could say the method itself is also epistemologically violent. But again, this would be very difficult to convince, I think, empirical psychologists to say, well, your method is violent. One could develop this argument, I think. So what I try to do is to say, in empirical research, you find epistemically or epistemologically violent interpretations. That is where you have violence. So you find, let's say, a difference between 2 groups. And then you provide an interpretation that suggests that one group is inferior, one group is problematic, basically interpretations that bring harm to that community. Then you have produced an epistemologically violent research. It's in the context of interpretation, because the data don't speak for themselves. If you find difference between 2 groups, you can interpret this in various ways, actually. But if you then propose an interpretation that brings harm to another group and present this as knowledge, then it's epistemologically violent. It's epistemologically violent. So, for example, to be more concrete, use not examples from race, but let's say you do a study on different numbers of women and men at Ivy League universities in the United States, or top universities in the United States, and you find that empirically that there's still more men than women in elite universities in the United States, especially in certain fields. And then this is what you find. Then you say, well, women are less intelligent than men. Mm-hmm. That would be, for me, an epistemologically violent interpretation. If you present this as knowledge in your discussion, let's say in your interpretation of data, because it brings harm to one group, and the data itself of difference does not determine this interpretation. So the fact that you find difference between two groups does not determine the interpretation. You also have a variety of interpretations possible for one and the same data set, but if you choose an interpretation that is harmful to one group, you have proposed an epistemologically violent interpretation. So this is where I basically located epistemological violence. If you choose an interpretation that brings harm to one group community, despite having alternative, equally viable interpretations available, and you present this as knowledge, then you have committed a form of epistemological violence. And I wanted to do this with the psychological community. So I wanted to do this even with traditional psychologists can agree on that. That was the attempt, because methodologists know that interpretations are not the same as the results. The results are different from the interpretation of results. So I think traditional epistemologists and methodologists who pay attention, they know that actually. And that's exactly what I wanted to emphasize. And so being interested in scientific racism, I think this is where you find plenty of examples that when you find differences between two groups, suddenly the interpretations that are presented as knowledge are provided in a way that harms one group but not the other group.
Right.
More generally, you could ask the question, how do you make persons into problems? How do you make persons into problems? And you can do this, of course, my argument is you can do this, of course, sociopolitically in our culture. Like, you have discourse about certain groups, you have materialities, meaning you put certain groups of people in certain locations, or, if you fence in migrants, if you don't provide food and water and so forth, certain practices. This is how you can sociopolitically make people into problems, but you also can do it through research. That was my point here. So for research, you can do this as well. And this can be empirical research, where interpretations, especially interpretations, make groups of people into problems. And you can also do it, of course, you could do it in the psychological humanities as well, because we have this as well. You have it in history, and we have it in art, and we have it in philosophy, that certain groups of people were also made into problems. You could just philosophize, theorize about groups of people and say they are a problem because A, B, C. But my point is you can also do it empirically. Just suggesting that you do an empirical study and therefore you're just fact-based is inaccurate for a variety of reasons, including the problem, I think, of epistemological violence. So sometimes people don't mention, so to say, the context of that in detail, but I'm perfectly fine. That's what I say with you. So I have a concept which has probably a narrow definition, but you like it, jump with it, and jump into a space that is comfortable to you and that is useful to you. So I'm perfectly fine when people do that. A person once asked me, is this okay that I use it that way, or is it not according to your intentions? And I said, no, it's completely okay with me if you do that. Maybe I have different intentions, but for me, it's indeed, so to say, you jump out into space and do with this concept what you want to do with this concept. So you don't have to have exactly my limitations to that concept.
Mm-hmm. And even I really like that you confine the initial stage of your presentation to the context of interpretation, but that the interpretive lens transfers itself to the way people choose, and they're committed to a method, to a line of questioning, to a line of research. So their commitments within a context of discovery is because of their interpretive commitments. And
yes.
yeah.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. There's a certain circle
Mm-hmm.
or circuit that, you have a certain theory, you have a certain methodology, you have certain questions, you have certain way of doing the research, you have certain interpretations, and you have a certain way of presenting it. And then it feeds back into your next study, where you have another set of questions, and you have a reinforcing system, circuits of research, I guess. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So my next question that I wanted to ask you, we have already touched on it indirectly. It basically has to do with, I wanted to ask your perspective about this distinction between the scientific community, or a community of scholars on one hand, and the rest of the public on the other hand, or the general public. And given that there is generally that division in society, in a given society, and isn't it always a risk of, and psychology being one of those scholarly communities or scientific communities, isn't there always a risk of the scientific community cutting their ties from the real social issues, the real social processes? And when they do that, they lose touch with what is indigenous in that community. So it doesn't have to be the betrayal or so-called betrayal of the indigenous psychology. It doesn't have to always be because there is something being imposed. Like I was teaching psychology in a part of China, and I clearly could feel that this thing I'm teaching, this way of research, this way of viewing these concepts, don't really belong here. They are being imposed. So that's one way, but it doesn't always have to be that. It could be just the organic or the natural consequence of just having this community that separates itself from the rest. So I was wondering, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think when, I'm also one of the co-editors of an indigenous psychology book series. And so I thought a little bit about this topic. And, when we talk about, I think you're absolutely right that, first of all, we have to clarify what we mean by indigenous psychology. So indigenous psychology could indeed be the psychologies of indigenous peoples. Let's say the psychologies of Algonquin in Canada as one example. Mm-hmm. It's also used very much when people are about indigenous psychology as the psychologies of former colonized or semi-colonized countries that have their own intellectual traditions, such as China or India, or you even sort of say psychologies of other continents, such the indigenous psychology of Africa. And that's already a very different meaning of the same term. And then there's, of course, the argument that all psychologies are indigenous, which is a critical assumption, which means also that American psychology is an indigenous psychology, the indigenous psychology of Americans. But what you add is another complexity, actually, with your question. Namely, to which degree is American psychology really indigenous of Americans? If we assume that American psychologies are indigenous psychologies. And you ask the question whether American scientific psychology is just indigenous of the scientific community that developed that psychology and then distributed to the public more or less effectively. And then you can, of course, go further with this question. Well, so they gave it away to the public, but to whom do they give it away? Is it just then white, educated, industrialized, middle-class communities, but nobody else? So then it's, I think, another layer. But I think you're right to suggest that maybe scientific psychology is actually not always indigenous to the cultural context, and sometimes it's indigenized, meaning it's given away, and people are supposed to understand themselves and other people through the concepts, theories, and results of scientific psychology. And I mentioned this before in terms of psychologization, psychologizing the world. But of course, there's still even then there's a difference between scientific psychology and popular psychology, because they might not completely do justice to the terms they are used in scientific psychology, but in which concepts are then actually popularized. So people use, of course, the term defense mechanism from psychoanalysis, or attachment theory from developmental psychology, or plasticity, neuroplasticity from neuroscience. They use terms like justice, resilience in the public, and trauma as clinical concepts. But you still have the problem: to which degree is that way of using concepts coming from academic psychology done in a correct way? And I think there's a certain contempt by scientific psychology when pop psychology doesn't accurately reflect what scientific psychology intends to do with a concept or a theory. Mm-hmm. But of course, there is a mutual interdependence of scientific psychology and popular psychology, because scientific psychology's popularity is fueled by the public and popular interest in pop psychology, actually. Mm-hmm. So many students, of course, go in with interest in pop psychology and clinical psychology and consulting and counseling and psychotherapy, and they use some of the concepts maybe not the way they're used in scientific psychology, but this membrane, so to say, where you have the nexus between scientific psychology and pop psychology is exactly, I think, where both actually thrive. It doesn't answer completely your question, actually, because I think it's a serious question that has to be analyzed. And I think I used to be actually more on this side, that scientific psychology is actually not relevant to regular people, actually. And you can develop a whole critique of that scientific psychology is relevant to regular people. But I've become a little more try to do justice to more complexity, because there are certain concepts that come from scientific psychology that permeate and become relevant in the public as well. And I gave just only a very few examples. So I think that there is something coming out of scientific psychology when people then talk about themselves in terms of neuroplasticity, for example, or temperaments, or attachment styles, or resilience, where personality, conscientiousness, extroversion, whatever you have, that fuels basically the public imagination as well. So I think you can follow both streams, that maybe there's a lack of relevance of scientific psychology, and then what forms of scientific psychology or what concepts actually become filtered down to the public, and why do they filter down to the public, and then feed back into scientific psychology as well. So I think you have both moments emerging, that maybe scientific psychology is indigenous to the scientific community, but also scientific psychology, the elements and streams of that, they go actually into the public as well. So, and I don't have, so to say, a full analysis of this, because I haven't studied it well enough, I guess. But I think it needs to be studied in exactly that way. To which degree is scientific psychology relevant, and to which degree actually does it provide distorted forms of relevance, or even actual relevance to people? That is a different question, I think, but a different stream. But I think we should keep this in mind, what you said, that what you mentioned, you teach psychology and there is no resonance from students because it's maybe so alien. And this even relates back, I think, to my own biography. So, when we ask why was I interested in critical psychology, because that's exactly what we had as well. So it's a unique situation in German-speaking psychology. Let's say in what we would call the Americanization of German-speaking psychology, and then the imported theories from the United States. And you didn't know, what does this have to do anything with how I live my life? because it reflected the actual interests of an American psychology, and so importing psychology, in this case even to a German, which is a similar culture, if you like, in the German-speaking culture, was alien to us to a certain degree and didn't make sense. And I think that led to a certain opposition to Americanized psychology, in my case, at the University of Vienna, where we had a student group that was dissatisfied what was taught, and we couldn't relate to that, what was taught in many ways, and didn't know what was going on. And you have to be socialized, as you said, to become indigenized into the scientific community in order to participate in the language games of the scientific community in order to make sense, actually. So I think this is an interesting topic, that the dialectics of relevance and irrelevance of scientific psychology, even within the same culture, even if we say that American psychology is an indigenous psychology of American culture, we have to think about what aspects are actually relevant.
Absolutely. What you refer to as the context of translation, we could think of that as an overlap between two different contexts, one being the context where the public lives, the rest of the public lives, and then the context that scientists live and they are trying to communicate. Similar to how the context of discovery is a shared context. In many occasions, it is shared by the participants who might have a totally different view of what is going on in the research during their participation in a research project, and the scientists have their own reading of that. So they're shared. What are your thoughts on switching topics a little bit, but we might link it to what we have discussed so far? What are your thoughts on the current state of academia and people? Do you detect a pattern of people leaving or not succeeding in finding jobs? Is it like a phenomenon that is growing, or no?
Yeah. I think I find all those phenomena. I find people who don't find jobs. I find people who left academia. I've one of my own one of my PhD students left a tenure track position, and I know people who don't even want to work in academia anymore. So I think we have all of those streams, and how shall we understand that? And okay, I didn't do research on that myself, but I've done work on epistemologies, and I think you have very narrow epistemologies that are not inviting actually to people who want to expand their own epistemologies. So the realm of possibility and the realm of horizon is becoming smaller. Hyper-specialization, as people have characterized it. But it's not only hyper-specialization, it's hyper-narrow-mindedness as well. So hyper-specialization is not necessarily a problem, but if you keep an open mind and say other people should do this, and I'm doing this, and I'm narrow, a very narrow research topic, but I'm happy that people do other stuff. But the point is that often people in the community say, because I'm hyper-specialized, it's the only way you can actually do research. And there's no other way of doing research. I think so there's an epistemic culture, I think, that has become more complex. I think the work conditions, and so in the case of one of my students, the argument was, the who wanted to have a family, the extremely long work hours that you invest, and then sometimes you do a lot of service work, and then it is completely ignored by administration. So the administration might ask you to do something, to figure something out, you make proposals, and then it's ignored. Basically, you spend hours and hours and hours doing this, but it has zero impact. So I think this is the work conditions. The power of administration has, of course, increased, and the power of faculty has decreased. So more and more faculty are constructed, I guess, as employees, and administration as employers, and you're workers, and you do what we tell you to do. if I have to theorize this, and I've done a little bit of that, I would theorize it also as the neoliberalization of academia. So academia has to follow business principles, market principles, what I mentioned before, fast science versus the traditional idea of slow science, focus on quantity over focus on quality, only quantity counts, quantification of output, citation rates, journal impact, and then that is the only criterion how we evaluate individuals or academics. So let me give an example. Let's say you have the world foremost expert on medieval psychology. It's a very narrow field. It would be a very narrow field, but the person in this small community is considered the top expert in this narrow field. They would never reach the citation rate of an average neuroscientist, as one example. Just a middle-of-the-road neuroscientist has more publication than the foremost expert on medieval psychology, just for the fact that the area is very small. But if modification is the only criterion, you only reinforce certain forms of research and you put down other forms of research. I think which is just one outcome of neoliberalization. What does the market want? And then you could look at more strange phenomena such as the marketing of science that has to be done in psychology as well, which involves exaggerating one's own contributions instead of what I call epistemic grandiosity or epistemic modesty, the selling of research, the promoting of research, even the marketing of oneself. Again, academic grandiosity, selling yourself as an expert in all areas, when in fact you may be an expert in very few areas, but you have to become an expert in all areas. You become an academic celebrity, and you have to have answers for every question that is posed to you. And you can say, I don't know enough about this thing actually to give you an opinion. No, I can't give you an opinion because I have to market myself. And it's the epistemic grandiosity. Because I'm an expert in one area, I'm an expert in all areas. So there's some, I think, of those things that occur in academia that are not really inviting to young scholars, early career scholars. The amount of work, the constant competition, the quantity over quality. You can't rest and think. You have to constantly publish. Is maybe a problematic workspace. On the other hand, there's still, so to say, depending, I guess, on the university, working place to do things, and where you're not trapped as much within neoliberal academia. And I think that York University is maybe one of those universities still, or we still have a historical, theoretical, and critical studies of psychology program. There are some problems, I guess, that are also going on, but don't want to go into details.
Sure.
But there are still spaces where people can do things, but those spaces seem to become smaller and more rare.
Yep. And even this, yeah, go ahead.
I'm just interested in what you think as well. What your thoughts on this phenomenon? I'm interested.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that I can share with you is spaces for genuine interest and excitement about psychological topics. It's very rare to find it, even in high prestige departments of psychology. I was closely in I'm familiar with what happens in University of Toronto. It's surprising. Like, I think some people would be shocked to know that people in their free time, when they leave their offices to go have a drink or go have lunch, they just don't want to talk about psychology. They don't want to talk about research. For them, it's the business. They do it, and they would just want to. And the older, some of these colleagues I am still in touch with, they have this impatience with it. So to me, it seems like this part of that neoliberal subjectivization. The effect of that is that it creates that shell around us, but it's emptied out. The thing that is supposed to be inside, within it, that core, which is passion, interest, curiosity, that slowly leaves, and we only get this shell. Even in individuals who are active, who are still publishing. But what, unfortunately, and this is a little bit, for me, it saddens me. What feeds the system is that incoming stream of students who still have passion, and they come in, they get involved, and then they become part of the process. And the people who run the lab, they kind of use those energies, they use those enthusiasm to get the projects done, get the publications done, and then who knows what will happen to the students, but the person who runs the lab will get promotion or get awards. Of course, what I say doesn't really apply to people in your program, history and theory of psychology. I know you, Chris Green, we had one person at the University of Toronto who has a critical psychological research interest and research program. And he also hosted a reading group with some of the undergraduate students. And he was genuinely interested. So that's an odd situation. Mm-hmm. For me, I'm not formally, I'm outside of academia, but I still try to have these, like the conversations we're having now, conversations about psychology. And I think it is possible to have them. It just gets a little bit confusing because within institutions give us that formal spaces where we're supposed to have and pursue these interests. But then we get entangled with this logic of production and productivity and competition and marketing and all those things that you mentioned, to the point that the image becomes more important than the thing itself. Mm-hmm. And the choice of maybe even sacrificing the real thing to preserve the image. Like how people, yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, but is it also, I mean, what you brought up before with indigenization, is the research is so indigenous, mm-hmm. so artificial to that very scientific community that actually outside of that, it has no relevance or application or no translation. Yeah. It is so artificial and abstract and removed from how people live their everyday lives that you actually cannot even talk about it anymore because it is something completely alien to the way people actually conduct their everyday lives.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Not just the other people, but the person themselves will find it difficult to keep thinking about it once they're outside. It's like the person who is auto-exploiting, the person who's exploiting themselves during the work hours, they want to forget that auto-exploitation when they're off the clock. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't even have to be about interactions with other people. Mm-hmm. Like I had dinner with one of my mentors, graduate school mentors recently, and it was just clear they didn't want to talk about research. And we walked together to the public library, Toronto Public, one of the branches of the public library. And this person was shocked that I'm going into the public library to pick up some books. I was like, you read books? You mean physical books? I was like, so there's that within psychology. This is something that special in psychology. There's a kind of almost I want to call it anti-intellectualism, but it's anti-philosophy, anti-reflection on what is really happening. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you have encountered it.
Yeah.
For years.
Yeah. And that's also why we try to, promote the psychological humanities. But of course, that's a losing battle as well, because the psychological humanities don't have the same status, power, money as the psychological sciences. That's a reality.
Yeah. So there's a trap in people who have a position in theory and history and theory of psychology, people who are, for example, parts of the Division 24. Do you think there's a trap for them to become cynicism and hopeless? Do you think that there's an ethical dimension to all of this, and like we should do our best, continue to work, and not become cynical?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if it's cynical, but they don't think there's a home for them in psychology, actually. Some of the people who did theoretical psychology. York is slightly different because we have a home, but I know people in Germany, for example, who went to Denmark, who went to the United Kingdom, and who went to the States because they don't think there was a home for them in a psychology department. And some of them went to different departments, sociology, even business, because psychology didn't have a place for that type of thinking. If you think in that way, you are an extreme outsider. And I think I know whom you're talking about at U of T. And once you do that, you are an outsider.
Yeah.
And you don't have a community. It's very difficult to be, to conduct your everyday life as an academic.
That's right.
If nobody else responds in that way to you.
Yeah. There's a lot more we can say on this topic, but maybe for in the interest of time, we can at some other points, maybe we can have like with a group of people, we can discuss this symposium on symposium on the future of psychology. So anything that
just a second one. So we have a colloquium. Maybe you can speak about this. It's unfortunately this colloquium, this season is already finished. I mean, this academic year, but maybe next year, speaking exactly about this topic, leaving academia or something.
Yeah, and I can tell you about some of the workplaces you talked about, oppressive workplaces. I had for about 6 months, I worked in a place where the boss, the manager, told us that you're not allowed to get sick more than a couple of days per year. So forget about like needing therapy or counseling. Physical illness was like questioned. So, but this is like this is like a happy coincidence that I can use these examples as I'm thinking about psychology in our current times. So leaving could be a way of continuing for some of us. Anyway, anything that my last question, anything that we didn't touch on about your current concerns? I know that psychological humanities is a big theme. I listened to your conversation with Professor Green, and in that conversation, you said that you addressed something that I have often thought about, which is like, can we get psychological humanities by reading a novel? And in that, your response was, no, it's about explicating it and making it more clear what the psychological relevance of this work is, and work of art or novel. But in general, I wanted to ask you about your current projects and interests.
Yeah, I think a big project of mine is indeed a theory of subjectivity, and I think I can answer some of the questions you just asked. So when I talk about, so I'm trying to figure out what could be certain principles in a theory of subjectivity. And I say, for example, one important principle for me is the entanglement, what I call socio-subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and intrasubjectivity. Then we can talk about what I mean by entanglement. Entanglement doesn't mean addition. Entanglement doesn't mean it's nested, like intersubjectivity is nested in intersubjectivity is nested in socio-subjectivity. No, it's really entangled. You cannot, disentangle it anymore. It's entangled to the degree that in an adult person you cannot disentangle it anymore. You cannot say how much is society, how much is culture, how much is interpersonal, how much is personal. But the general point is that if you want to understand a person's subjectivity, you have to understand society, history, culture in which this person lives. You have to understand which aspects of society, history, and culture this person stitches themselves into, not all of them, which is of course dependent on other societal realities. The importance of interpersonal, relational, intersubjective realities, and yes, there might be certain individual idiosyncrasies, preferences that have to be taken into account as well, always in its entanglement with the other dimension. So I would argue that is an important principle. Another important principle for me is that subjectivity is unique and irreplaceable. It's maybe a more metaphysical, philosophical statement, But because entanglements don't bear out the same way for everybody, because it's a unique entanglement, because society, history, culture produces, based on intersubjectivity and intersubjectivity, unique patterns. Subjectivity in that sense is unique. So even people who live in the same culture can have different subjectivities, obviously. And then another principle would be subjectivity is, and I think this is what we talk, is embedded in concrete everyday life. How we live our everyday lives, actually. We cannot, detach subjectivity, detached from everyday life. So we're not going to find subjectivity just lying on the couch. We're not going to find subjectivity just going into a lab. Mm-hmm. You have to study it the way it is embedded in everyday life. It's temporality and contextuality. So temporality can be historical, can be developmental, can be situational, and contextuality, of course, context change, and you have to take into account, do you live your life? Are we talking about subjectivity when you work, subjectivity in your free time, subjectivity in your relations, and so forth? And then subjectivity is constituted and or mediated through actions, discourses, and materialities. So I account for discourses, I want to account for actions, but also want to account for materialities. So technologies, for example, to which degree does a technology constitute or mediate subjectivity? Social media constitute or mediate subjectivity? And then I think it's important to think also about actuality and potentiality of subjectivity. So meaning basically what actually happens in human subjectivity and what is actually possible in human subjectivity. And that's an interesting way of thinking about subjectivity. So I don't write poetry, but I could write poetry. So it would be possible for me to write poetry. And so we have to think about potentialities as well, and not only actualities. And that's, of course, that would be non-representational research in psychology when we think about possibilities that people can have, possibilities of resistance if you come from a critical tradition, but it doesn't have to be possibilities of resistance. It also can be possible, such as what I said, just artistic possibilities, poetry, and it might not be successful or more or less successful, but I think a theory of subjectivity has to think about potentialities. And so this brings me back what we discussed before. So we have to think about subjectivity as we conduct our everyday lives, and not just what's happening in the lab, and then I don't want to talk about it anymore. And these are two different realms, and I capture subjectivity in its, pure form. And when it's outside in reality, it's not in its pure form anymore. No, I think we have to study it exactly in its messy form, in its mediations, in its embeddedness, in its entanglements. That is actually how we have to think about a subjectivity. And then, of course, we have to describe, I think, as well, when we talk about subjectivity, concrete forms of subjectivity, which I've done. How can we understand the neoliberal form of subjectivity? How can we understand supremacist or deglobalizing or fascist subjectivities, which would be a descriptive work as well, where we try to capture especially socio-subjectivities, and maybe how people suture themselves into neoliberal subjectivity as well. So that will be another way of doing research. But more generally, I'm interested really in a theory of subjectivity. I'm also interested in what I would call auto-epistemology. That's another small project I'm having at the moment. Really thinking about, what do I mean by knowledge? What are the sources of my knowledge? What comes from authority? What comes from research? What comes from movies? What comes from literature? What do I ignore? What are the limits of my knowledge? And I think this cannot be done solipsistically. And I've spent 3 months thinking about the limits of my knowledge. I found I don't have any limits in my knowledge. That would be not the right approach. you have to do it together with other people, and people that are radically different from you, come from radically different cultural traditions, for example. And so when I talk about subjectivity, it would have to be exposed exactly to people about radically different traditions and say, well, when we talk about subjectivity, we talk about X, Y, Z, and I might need to incorporate that in order to talk about subjectivity and say, well, this is not even what I consider. The blind spots that we have. So, for example, as a non-religious person, I might have a blind spot towards the reality that religiosity and spirituality is extremely important in a person's subjectivity, for example.
Mm-hmm.
What is the role of subjectivity when it comes to knowledge? You know, my position, location, time, my social characteristics, temporality and contextuality. So that is, you know, where we can ask about our own knowledge bases. And because for me it's important, we have this attack on critical research, on critical race theory and LGBTQ plus theories, on EDI, especially in the States. And so I want to double down on some of these issues. And, you know, then I ask, what is a white epistemology? And I try to lay out what is a white epistemology using a critical race theoretical approach. And why is EDI important as an epistemic project, not as purely as an organizational, institutional category, but why is equity, diversity, inclusion important as an epistemic category? And we can go back to what I said before, the different contexts. Why do we need diversity in the context of discovery? Why do we need diversity in the context of justification? Why do we need diversity in the context of interpretation? And why do we need diversity in the context of translation? So I think you can make an epistemic argument why this is actually important. And it's not just some spurious, you know, idea that people have, but that it's actually that it actually improves our knowledge practices if we take this seriously. So this is still part of the critical theoretical work that I want to, you know, double down on critical race theory and on EDI, and so these are some of the projects that I'm still continuing at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you very much, Professor Theo. It was a pleasure speaking with you. I hope we speak again and continue some of the threads that we opened here in this general interview. This was a general, like, introductory. I'm sure many of the people who follow material on my channel, they are already familiar with you, but for those few who are being introduced to you for the first time, I'm sure they would love to hear again maybe a more focused discussion of one of these topics, and maybe we can do it once the book on subjectivity is out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks again.
Thanks so much.